Cool.
Then, without further ado, I'd like to invite the first speaker of the
If someone is wearing an ankle bracelet and knows that the police currently know exactly where they are, that is a massive deterrent to them committing a crime in that moment. We think even in the worst case, when you have the most irrational actor, that is still something that they know they're going to get caught, that is going to have massive cut through. At the point at which we have less people getting assaulted, less people getting murdered, that is the point at which we win this debate. I'm going to start with some characterization, then going to move into my 3 points. Firstly, on why we get less violent crime through reoffending. We think we can win on this point alone. Secondly, on why it's just better for society in general because people feel more safe. Thirdly, on why we have more because we have more information on who is committing crimes. This means that we just have less discrimination. We have less bias because people just have more information. Starting with some characterizations, few pieces here. Firstly, we think electronic bracelets look like something that is tracking your location. That means the police knows where you are when you are there. We think you can't take it off. If you do take it off, then they know that. They can go check up on you, right? We think we have pretty good technology now. They're probably pretty small. They're probably pretty lightweight. They're probably pretty easy to hide, if you want to. Secondly, then, we think violent crimes look like assault. It looks like attempted murder. It looks like sexual assault. It looks like these really bad crimes. Right. Third piece, on why we think people are relatively rational when they commit crimes and care about getting caught. We think, firstly, most people just are acting rationally, but also, secondly, we think violent crimes are likely to be premeditated because it takes quite a lot to convince you that it is worth causing this much harm that you can immediately see in front of you. When you're assaulting someone, you can see that there's, you can see the harm in front of you. We think it takes quite a lot to convince you to do that. We think there's large build-up. We think you're thinking about it for a long time. We think there are opportunities to think about getting caught. Even if this is a thing of the moment crime of passion, we still think that people currently don't think they're going to get caught because it's quite hard for them to visualize the thing that the police is going to find, the place where the police is going to find their fingerprints. We think if they know and they can visualize easily the reason that's going to get caught, that is going to be a massive deterrent to them. We think that's something that can still go through your mind in the heat of the moment. Right. Last piece of characterization, why are people likely to reoffend if they've committed crimes in the past? Two main people we think commit violent crimes. Firstly, just individuals who do it out of necessity because they have a reason to do it, right? We think there's often a psychological element that means that they are driven to do this. We think these things will probably the psychological element probably still exists. We think another situation could arise that could lead them to commit another violent crime. We also think that when you go to prison, there's lots of things that you're surrounded by people who have done lots of violence. We think you have to do a lot of violence to survive in prison. We think that makes you more likely to do it when you get out. We also think there's lots of stigma. You probably can't get a job because people know you're a violent criminal. We think that also drives you to crime. Secondly, on groups, we think that things like gangs commit a lot of violent crimes out of necessity because it's needed for their business model, right? Because the way they make money by selling drugs or weapons or whatever they do requires them to do violence in order to get these things done. We think this still exists. We think you're likely to return to it again when you get out of prison because that's where all your connections are. I'll take a POI now.
Don't you think people are less likely to get a job if they have a physical bracelet showing the people that they've committed this violent crime?
We think that, firstly, as I told you, you can largely hide this physical bracelet by just wearing trousers or wearing socks that cover it if you're on your anklet. We think they're relatively small. But secondly, we think that largely employers know if you've committed a violent crime. It's on your record. They have that information anyway. That doesn't change.
Point of interest.
On to my first point now, on why we see less reoffending. Few mechanisms for this. Firstly, you just know you're going to get caught if you know that the police know exactly where you are. If the police, when they work out that this crime occurred in this place, can look at their records and go, look, you were there at that time. They're probably going to ask you some questions. You're probably going to get caught. We think you know this. We think it's relatively easy for you to visualize. That is a massive deterrent, right? We think that, criminals do actually care if they're going to get caught. You going to prison for a large amount of time never actually outweighs any benefit you're going to get from the crime. People commit crimes because they think they're not going to get caught. That changes. Secondly then, in terms of gangs, we think that if a gang knows you now have a bracelet that means the police know exactly where you are, they're going to want you to leave that gang, they're going to want you to not be committing these crimes because that inherently implicates them. We think that means that gangs push people out and get them out of these gangs. That's really positive. That means that they're not going to have all these factors encouraging them to commit crimes. Thirdly then, we think that you yourself are going to want to leave gangs, you're going to want to leave circles where lots of people are doing violence. That's because if you're out drinking with your friends from the gang at the bar and one of them commits assault while you're there, the police now know that you're in that location, you are implicated in that act. We think that means there's a large incentive for you to try and get away and not do things and being in places where crimes are being committed. The outcome of this is that we just have less people who we know are prone to committing crimes in social situations and with connections that are going to cause them to commit more crimes. We think people individually are less likely to commit crimes. We think this just means victims get hurt less. There is less psychological damage. We have better social cohesion because people feel less unsafe, because people don't feel like they're being targeted, because people don't feel. We think it undermines the gang culture of just reoffending of all of these things. We think that's really, really good. We think we can win on this alone. Secondly then, why it's better for society because people feel safer, right? A few reasons for this. Firstly, the people just feel like the government knows where violent criminals are. They feel like the government is doing something to know what's going on and who's committing crimes. We think even if the government isn't doing that much to monitor it because they don't have the resources or whatever, which we think is unlikely because the government is willing to spend on keeping people safe, but even if that's true, we think that people will feel violent criminals, the government knows where they are, the violent criminals aren't going to be able to come and do violent things to you. We think this is just positive because people feel safer. Secondly, people just feel like there's better justice. They feel like if something happens to someone, they're offender is more likely to get caught, they're more likely to go to prison, they're more likely to be taken out of the public, more likely to do less damage. And thirdly, they just, because of all the stuff I just talked about, know that there's going to be less reoffending because criminals know they're going to get caught, right? What this means is that people just feel safer, they feel less anxious, they feel more willing to go and do things. We think these are a bunch of positive benefits. Thirdly then, on why, when we know who commits crimes, we see less discrimination, we see less bias, right? Firstly, we think that people feel more like they know who the violent criminals are, right? We think that people feel like the government knows where the violent criminals are, they know what's going on. There's less likely to just think that someone of colour is going to commit a crime because they actually are able to know exactly who is a violent criminal who has this bracelet, right? Secondly, something like a workplace just feels more comfortable about having a violent criminal working there if it's after 30 years because they know this violent criminal has a bracelet. They feel like there's this extra level of protection around it. They're not so afraid of this violent criminal. We think this just reduces the stigma. Thirdly, and most importantly, we think the police just know that violent criminals aren't responsible for a crime. If they know that violent criminals is in a house, is far away from when the crime is being committed, we think this ultimately just means there's less stigmatization. These violent criminals who aren't committing at all aren't, getting harassed by the police. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and invite up the first speaker of the Negating team.
Exclusively on the negating side of the house, we provide a way for these criminals to be rehabilitated back into society, and we lessen the amount of reoffenders and make the victims feel safer. To start off with, I'm going to give you my first point on the negative effects of rehabilitation of criminals, and then my second point on the lack of effectivity for repeat offenders. My second speaker will talk about our split, the effects of victims and broader society. Our path to victory today will be to prove to you that these ankle monitors do not deter violent crimes and in fact have a positive benefit, not having them has a positive benefit to victims. To start off, a little bit of rebuttal. Well, first of all, the Affirmative team have pushed about like the fact that people are less likely to reoffend because they're scared of the security. Well, first of all, we see that like people still commit crimes in front of security cameras, they commit crimes in public where people are watching them. So we just see that this isn't largely true because they don't think about the consequences at the time, especially in violent crime, which often happens like in the heat of the moment. They don't think about these consequences. So therefore, it's just like this is not in fact true. And even if so, it's very minimal and doesn't actually, as I'll talk about in my first point, doesn't weigh up against the amount of reoffenders that will be happening. Second of all, they pushed a bit about the fact that we can't see the bracelets. Well, first of all, we don't think this is true. Even if we accept that they're maybe small, which we don't think is true if we want them to be like indestructible, we also think people will know what they look like in society. So even if they see a small bracelet, they still know what it means. And we just see that as well. They've talked about that people want to leave these gang circles because, the gangs want them to leave the circles because they don't want like the surveillance. We again see this as not being true. Like gangs want people in them. They would just mean that they might not bring them to each like thing of the crime. Like it doesn't mean they're just going to leave these gang circles because they know now that they might be associated more strongly. So moving on to my first point about the negative effects of rehabilitation. First of all, we're going to see that this is going to make it harder for criminals to like be reintegrated into society. As I mentioned before, people are going to see these bracelets. They're going to know what this person has done, but they're not actually going to know what violent crime they've committed. So in their minds, it's going to be like the worst possible scenario. Like this person could have almost killed someone. Like that's kind of the things people will be thinking when they see these people. In the status quo, all we have, like we still have people showing like that they've committed a crime if it's important in terms of like jobs or something. But like to the general public, they don't need to know that. So it's just like not like a public information, which just means also that like people believe they can change if other people do. But if the police don't think that you can change and be a better person and not commit these crimes again, people aren't going to think this. So my mix for this, first of all, is that the aim of society is like we want to stop people from reoffending or committing in the first place and like reintegrate them back into society. Like with an ankle monitor, this is basically impossible. Why? Well, because of a number of reasons. First of all, there's bias from society, as I mentioned before. It's harder to get jobs because people don't want like the customers knowing you've hired a criminal. People aren't going to want to go into your shop if they know that, which means people aren't going to get jobs, which is going to lead them to like needing to get money in other ways, which is probably criminal ways, which is like why these ankle monitors aren't going to deter that, because even if they're being surveilled and even if they're more likely to get caught, they still need the money, so that's not going to necessarily stop them. And this just creates more discrimination against like hiring criminals, which means they're going to have to turn to other places for money. Secondly, the general public now knows you've committed this crime, which means it's hard to reintegrate. You can't join clubs, you can't like help the community because they're scared of you. You can't even like walk into a shop without people like being afraid of you, which just means it's harder for you to like gain like a group of people you're associated with. So what happens then? This happens when we see people being isolated. We see them bonding with groups who are like in a similar situation. In this scenario, this is going to be other criminals or making other gangs. If these criminals come together to be accepted, like they're more likely to reoffend because there's now this group of criminals, and like the Affirmative team have told us that gangs won't want them because they know they're being like watched, but like there's nothing stopping these criminals all coming together, and they're all going to have these ankle monitors, and they're going to try and find a way around this, and they're still going to reoffend because at this point they don't have a job, they don't have a way to make money, they're going to need a way to collect this money, and whether or not this is like drugs or something, or like just coming to them committing higher levels of violence, like they're still going to be sucked back into these activities, and it's not actually going to help them like try and get back into society and try and improve and be a better person. Like they're compelled to be accepted by this gang, and they might mean to like commit worse crimes because they want this gang to like them, to accept them, to help them have this money that they haven't been able to have because they can't get a job. So what this means is that on our side of the house exclusively, these criminals can like move on, they can get a job, they can change for the better. We're not saying they're like hiding that they've been a criminal. The people who are like hiring them still know. It just means that like the general public doesn't have to know, the customers don't have to know, and this just means that like people are more willing to be friends with them. They're more willing to like help them like join their groups, their clubs or whatever, and they're not like compelled to join these gangs, to join these only ways to make friends and make money and stuff. So the impact of this. Okay, so if we say like take the affirmative side of the house, criminals can't get jobs, they can't integrate into society. This means they're forced to join the gangs. More people are now involved in these gangs, which means we have more repeat offenders, which is just like a way worse off society overall. So if you like can't reintegrate back into society, you're like perpetuating this cycle of crime. Exclusively on our side of the house, we can break this cycle of crime and rehabilitate these criminals into active members of society, which is overall a much better outcome for this debate. I'm moving on to my second point about the lack of effectivity for repeat offenders. So the Affirmative team have told us that this is going to help deter crime because people won't commit crimes if they are being watched. Well, why does this not happen? Well, this is for a number of reasons. First of all, why do people commit violent crimes? These crimes often happen because of like deep inrooted issues in society or in their lives. This looks like having a violent childhood. This looks like being like brought up around people who commit violent acts. This looks like being in the heat of the moment and not knowing how to regulate your emotions. So what do we do to these people? We imprison them to punish them for this crime. And then we try and rehabilitate them so they can get back into society so they can change. If we give them these bracelets, they're not going to be rehabilitated and they're going to keep committing these crimes. So what we see is that on the affirmative side of the house, we still have repeat offenders, we still have offenders because they have no reason to like not commit these crimes because in the heat of the moment they don't think about the consequences. Otherwise, like prison would be enough of a deterrent to not let these people commit these crimes. Therefore, like we see that people don't care about the consequences as much as the affirmative would like to tell you, and therefore we have like no change on either side of the house. But on our side of the house, we have less repeat offenders because we know that people can actually be changed and can actually reintegrate back into society. I'll take a POI now.
Is it better for the public to know who is a violent criminal, or for them to rely on their own judgment to decide who they think is likely to be a violent criminal, thus relying on discrimination?
First of all, we don't think people go walking around thinking, which of these people is a violent criminal as I'm walking down the street. People don't need to see that like crime is happening everywhere. If this person is not actively committing a violent crime, they shouldn't have this bias against them. And this bias happens whether or not they're wearing a bracelet or whether or not it's because of discrimination. It's still a form of discrimination that they see these people with these bracelets and think, wow, they're probably going to attack me. I'm going to move away from them. I'm going to be scared of them. Because instead, like this person might be trying to change. Maybe their crime, although obviously it was strong enough to like return them in prison, it could have been while they were young. They could have been caught up in an activity and they want to change, but they can't because people are scared of them because they see these bracelets. We just think this is a negative thing for people to be walking around and thinking about crime all the time because they're seeing these bracelets. So moving on to my second point about the lack of effectivity, like the affirmative team seems to think this deters repeat offenders because of surveillance. First of all, as I mentioned, they've actually lived the punishment for this crime. They don't deserve to also now be for the rest of their lives like tracked by the police because like once they committed a crime and now they're trying to change. This could have happened when they were young and now for the rest of their lives they have to be like in this like situation where they know they've committed the crime. It's a constant awareness for them as well as other people that this crime has happened and they can't like move on from this moment because it's like a physical reminder that this happened and that like we think that they deserve to like move on from that moment and try and be a better person. So even if we can accept on our side of the house that like they do get caught easier for a repeat offender because of the monitor, it's not a deterrent. And all that's happening is that on their side of the house, more criminals are committing crimes and then getting caught. On our side of the house, we have less criminals altogether, which is a much better outcome. So on our side, so if we can just prove to you here, we've proved to you that on our side of the house it makes no change in deterring crime. So even if we can only prove that our only outcome is some criminals can be rehabilitated instead of repeat offending, that's still a much better outcome than having more criminals altogether in society. So at the end of the speech, what you should have is exclusively on our side of the house, it's possible for criminals to be rehabilitated and to be reintegrated into society and be an active member of society. On the affirming side, all they have is people can't reintegrate into society because of bias against them and they're forced back into the cycle of crime. So even if we agree reoffenders are caught a bit easier, the small benefit is hugely outweighed by the huge increase of reoffenders on the AF side, creating a more violent society in the first place that doesn't allow for change. Thank you.
Speaker for their speech and invite up the second speaker of the affirming team.
In the US, when the box that you tick to say if you had done crime or violent crime in the past was taken off, what happened is people and employers just stopped hiring people of colour because they presumed, because of racist stereotypes, that those people were likely to have committed crimes. Their whole case relies on the fact not only that the stigma and discrimination doesn't already exist, which it clearly does, but that it won't because like employers can see that they're like people have committed crimes, but that even if it doesn't, why it's still negative, why it still harms these people and hurts rehabilitation. We've got 2 points of clash for you. Firstly, like the effectiveness and whether this actually is going to happen, whether it's going to actually stop crime, and then secondly, whether or not like there is stigma and whether that hurts rehabilitation of these criminals. I'd like to note that we think what's most important in this debate is effectiveness and whether it actually happens, because we think it hurts more people, like it's more of a benefit if we stop crime because it hurts more people. We think that's what's most important. So I'm going to touch on that first, right? I think the first thing we heard is that like people are still going to commit crimes because like they don't think about things, otherwise they wouldn't go to prison, right? I think we give a bunch of really good reasons at first of why we think people still act slightly rationally, right? We think there are like heat of the moment things in which like they are going to act less rationally in general, but we think people like go to prison, for example, because they don't clearly see how like they are going to get caught. Things like fingerprints and DNA and CCTV that they don't realize are there, right? People don't see that these things are there. They don't like realize that. It's pretty clear that the police is following you when you have to have a bracelet on you like all the time that you are aware is there. Whenever there is like a violent crime like that's in the exact same place that you were, you like the police question you, you very quickly realize that the police are following you. We think you are always aware of this, and note, we don't have to prove that like all violent crime is going to stop because people are aware. We just have to prove that to a significant extent, violent crime like reduces, right? Okay, also, again, we don't think we've had any interaction with the idea that lots of these things are like premeditated, because we think that like it's kind of hard to kill somebody because it's like not very nice to like actively be doing that. We think it probably takes you a lot of time to like get into the like kind of headspace of where you really, really dislike someone enough to like kill them or assault them or do really bad things. We think at the point in which you're like thinking about how am I going to do this, what is this going to be like, you also, as we said at first, as we haven't had any interaction with, are going to be like, okay, maybe at this point the police are probably going to find me, right? And then again, also, we think that like there are these gangs, right? And this is going to touch into this idea of like the gangs still want people, right? We think that's just completely untrue. What gangs want is they want to make money, they want to make power. At the point when everyone in your gang gets arrested because like the police know exactly where you were, exactly what you were doing when a bunch of violent crime happens, of course the gang doesn't want you in their group. The people that like end up doing violent crime because they're just like in that mob mentality with that bunch of group, and that's how they don't act rationally, that doesn't happen anymore because the gang just like kicks them out and like doesn't want to hang around them because they don't want to get arrested, right? Okay, I think we've set up a lot of different reasons on like why this still happens, right? Why we still get effectiveness and like actually reduce crime. Note, at that point, we just win the debate. Like, we don't actually need to prove that we get better rehabilitation, because the amount of people that have committed violent crimes and that also like even have the possibility of possibly getting rehabilitated is so low that it like compared to the amount of people that suffer from violent crime, and secondly, the amount of people who now feel safer because like there isn't, you know, they feel like the people are looking out for them. We think those harms, those benefits way outweigh any possible harms that they have. At that point, we win the debate, but now let's like deal with this, right? We heard this idea that like these bracelets are going to lead to stigma and then lead to reoffending, right? I'd like to note a couple things, right? Again, all of these things of like, we value this less importantly. We think at best for neg, this is like mitigation and not case winning stuff, right? I mean, debate winning stuff, right? We think that these bracelets are going to be relatively inconspicuous because like the government knows the stigma exists. The government thinks the stigma is bad. They've just given us a bunch of reasons of why the stigma is bad. That means the government is going to be really incentivized to make inconspicuous bracelets. Secondly, there's going to be a bunch of companies who can make a bunch of profit who are going to be incentivized to make inconspicuous bracelets. And then thirdly, you're going to have a bunch of people who now wear these bracelets and are thinking of like, how do I hide this in inconspicuous ways? As soon as someone realizes, oh, trousers, probably a good idea. Oh, putting something over like the bracelet bracelet, like, you know, making a nice like embroidered bracelet over top of it, suddenly that spreads like crazy because there's a bunch of demand for this kind of thing. We think this doesn't happen. And then like, also, I'd like to note that a lot of their stuff was like, these employers aren't going to hire people because they see them with like their bracelet on. And when we like had POIs and responded on stuff of like, don't they already see that they have reoffending? The only thing that they like got down to was that like the consumers and the customers are going to see these bracelets. Note that this like defends all of those like ideas because we think these bracelets are going to be hidden. We think these bracelets are going to be inconspicuous. But also the idea that like there is a bunch of ex-violent criminals who are working in customer service, like I just don't think is realistic. I think probably these people are working in like sort of manual labor or like things like that. We don't think there's much interaction with customers. And you know what's a lot worse? What's a lot worse is every time there is like a violent crime in like the suburb or city that is similar to a violent crime you did, when someone comes into your workplace and the police have to question you every single time there is a murder, and like all of your foremen, all of the people that are working on site have to deal with the police consistently coming in, with you being taken down to the police station, with like all of these allegations and all of them very clearly realizing that you've probably done some bad things in the past. I think that is where we get stigma. But on our side of the house, that only happens when you are like in the bar where the violent crime happened, when you are indirectly in the area. We think that is why all of the stigma is way, way better on our side of the house. We think we've completely flipped that. I'll take a POI very quickly if you have one.
Yeah, if gangs don't want to be associated with criminals to be like tracked for their crimes, then why do they wear like gang patches to associate themselves with their patches?
Okay, gang patches, people wear gang patches because like it's nice, it gives them a sense of community, they think people are scared of them. Gang patches, until recently, was not enough to arrest you, right? Now they don't wear gang patches because they're going to get arrested. No one likes being arrested. Okay. Once we've like set all of that up, I'd like to then touch on this idea that I brought up, and this is again on the idea of stigma, on this like more general idea of like general racism, right? Of at the point when people don't know who's the violent criminals, and people most definitely are thinking about violent criminals because that's just like way the human mind works. We are like naturally sort of conspiratorial, right? At the point in which people feel like they know that who the criminals are, that means we get way less assumptions that like, oh yeah, that person over there who's like got a hood is like going to stab me. We think that brings a lot of benefit to society. We think all of these benefits mean we clearly win this debate, and note that their big push has been against something that isn't case winning, that we don't need to win this debate. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and invite up the second speaker of the Negating.
Right, firstly in today's debate, I am going to do some rebuttal on their points about deterrence of crime, their points on feeling safer in the communities, and their points on discrimination. Then I'm going to do my split on why safety and justice is going to increase in society, specifically for victims. Now, first on their point about like deterrence of crime, because people are going to get caught because they're being tracked by the police. And this is really important, right? Because their whole case kind of falls on this idea that crime is going to decrease because they are going to get caught for it because they're being tracked. First of all, they tell us this is because like crime is premeditated, right? Violent crime is premeditated. We think this is like quite a mischaracterization, right? For a couple reasons, right? First of all, like a lot of violent crime often kind of looks like domestic violence, right? It looks like violence that has been influenced by maybe like substance abuse, right? With alcoholism, right? We see this in bar fights. We see this like in domestic violence and stuff, like people being like, people like having violence around, right? And this is often like heat of the moment. We tell you again and again, right? Not all crime is premeditated. They keep using this excuse of like murder is like this like prime example of premeditated violence. And like, yes, while that's true, that's not the like most committed crime in New Zealand, like violent crime especially. So I think it's quite harmful for them to like focus on this because it doesn't really help their case. So we tell you that like, they tell you that like it's going to be a deterrence because like they have premeditated like violent crime, and so they're going to stop and think about how they're going to get caught for this crime. First of all, we tell you that this isn't true, as Thora brought up, because there's like surveillance already existing in society, right? There are like cameras out there that police literally use to track your location, to track who has committed that crime, right? There's also other things like people just being out and about, like witnesses, things like this. Like crime doesn't stop because like surveillance is happening, right? People still commit crimes with CCTVs being used, right? People still commit crimes out in public spaces like bar fights, right? They still commit crime against people and stuff with witnesses there. So we don't really see that it being like super plausible that all crime is just going to like decrease significantly because the police are going to know that it was like them and where they were, right? Because crime already happens when the police know where they are or who it is, right? With the CCTV example. They also tell us that like crime is going to stop because like they want to leave, like that gangs aren't wanting like criminals in their spaces being tracked with these bracelets, right? Because it's going to like identify the crime and the time and place, right? First of all, we tell you like no, simply like this is a weird kind of like idea that gangs don't want like violent criminals being involved in their gangs, right? Like gangs are associated with violent crime, right? So it's kind of weird for them to say that like they don't want violent criminals in their gangs anymore, even though that's kind of what the gangs are like perpetrating in the first place. But also like we tell you that we don't really see this being plausible that they're going to like want to leave these circles of like crime, right? First of all, as Thora has told you, because people are going to be further ostracized from society because of these bracelets, right? Because there are these bracelets out, right? Whether you're hiding them or not, or whether you're like bedazzling them and things, you still have them permanently on your body for the rest of your life, right? This is like an unavoidable part of your body. And even if you remove them, it's just going to get reattached to you, right? So it's always going to be with you, always in public spaces. It's always going to be there when you're trying to get a job, when you're trying to socialize with people, right? And you become defined by the fact that you are wearing this bracelet that identifies you as someone who has committed violent crime, whether you are constantly reoffending this violent crime or whether you are not, right? So we see that this just ostracizes people, right? And when you have like ostracization, when you are being like kind of like marginalized in society for this one thing, you try to seek out like connection with other people. We see this with like Alcoholics Anonymous when people like go to these support spaces to like feel connected with other people who are struggling. So we are just going to see this, as Thora has mentioned, with these bracelets, right? Because people in society are being ostracized for being violent criminals, right? We're going to see violent criminals actually like coming together and form communities, right, of people. We already see this with gangs in society because they commit violent crime and they find other people who commit violent crime to like make friends, right? But we just see this as like people aren't going to leave spaces of violent crimes because they have these bracelets. We're actually going to see it increase for those reasons I mentioned. Now on to the second point about them saying that people are going to feel safer because like the government is keeping tabs on violent criminals. I've already given you some material right now, and Thora has, about surveillance and how it isn't effective enough, right? Violence happens in public spaces all the time. So it happens out in public and it happens in like bar fights. There's security cameras. We've already told you this, right? Second of all, we tell you that like, again, like to push back on this, like people are always going to like associate with other violent criminals, right? We tell you this with gangs. We tell you with this theory of like differential association, right? That people just like end up kind of committing more crime when they are associated with people who commit crime, right? And we already tell you reasons why this is likely, okay? So we're just going to see more crime happening because of these communities of violent criminals, because of them being identified by them being violent criminals, right? So we're just going to see more crime overall. So therefore, like this point of feeling safer in society doesn't happen. Now I want to touch on discrimination and how they claim that discrimination will increase in this world. And this is really important, right? Because this impacts a very marginalized group in society, like these minorities who are overrepresented in violent crime in New Zealand, right? We already know that minorities are overrepresented in prison for violent crime, right? So therefore, under their model, these minorities are going to be overrepresented with these bracelets in society, right? This is really harmful, one, because they are going to be like over associated with violent crime in society. So we're just going to see more discrimination on them, right? We're going to see more people like being discriminated based on their race because they are overrepresented in violent crime because of these like cycles of crime, because of these causes like we told you like differential association, we told you like socioeconomic conditions that drive crime, right? We also tell you that like like this is really, really bad, right? Because they claim that this is like good, that they are decreasing discrimination because like people now kind of just like know who the criminals are, and so therefore they're going to stop using racial bias. But we tell you that like this is completely not true. That like racial discrimination is just going to increase because now these people are publicly outed as criminals, right? They're being overrepresented in society as being like identified criminals, and this is particularly harmful because it not only impacts just people in general society, it impacts them trying to get jobs, right? It impacts them trying to like reintegrate into society, and it also impacts their interactions with the police, right? Because if you're like a minority who was already struggling with racial bias within like the justice system, if you're there at the sign of a crime but you didn't even commit it, right? Because you're already identified as a violent criminal, there's already this added layer of extra bias, right? I'll take a POI now.
Do gang members plan on getting caught?
Okay, well, first of all, no, they don't, right? But this is actually good for us because, like, first of all, like, they don't really care about, like, all these reasons, right? We tell you that, like, violence isn't innately, like, premeditated, right, for all these reasons. We tell you that they don't innately care, right? They don't really care about, like, all these, like, surveillance things and whatnot. So, like, no, they don't really care about getting caught, right? Because they just don't really think about these things because of violent crime. Now I'm going to go quickly on my split about victims, and this is pretty important, right? First of all, we already know that it's the best interests of victims to stop offenders from committing crime, right? Like this is the end goal of justice. Whether you want it to be punitive, whether you want it to be like rehabilitative, the end goal is to stop violent offenders from committing crime again. So what do we see on their side, right? We see that this rehabilitative like system is gone, right? We see that criminals aren't able to like reintegrate themselves into society because they are publicly outed as criminals. We see these added layers of discrimination that I've mentioned before. This means that they aren't able to reintegrate themselves into society, and so they often just kind of like go back into these spaces of crime that we've already told you about. This is bad for victims because it doesn't stop these cycles of crimes that they are wanting to end, right? It also means that like overall, we just told you like this isn't going to stop crime effectively, right? Because if prison doesn't already like stop crime in harsher sentences, why are like something smaller or like less punishing going to like stop crime, right? So we just tell you that overall on our side, we are going to have the cycles of crime broken. We are going to see offenders like reintegrating into society and breaking these cycles of crime, which is really important because it's important for victims, it's important for minorities, and it's important to decreasing crime. That is why we win today's debate.
I'd like to thank you for this speech and would like to be the first speaker of the Affirmative.
Okay, my principal problem with the Neg case is that it basically tries to have the entire debate take place on their court, where these ankle bracelets are like giant smartphones taped to your wrist, which everyone can see, and doesn't engage with any of the mechanisms we've given you as to why these are totally going to be things which you cannot see. If you believe that these are going to be small ankle bracelets, then they cannot win this debate. But actually, even if they're massive, that's probably better for our side of the house. The overall way I see this debate is, look, if the bracelets are small, there's no ostracism, their entire case falls apart. Even if the bracelets aren't small, the alternative is probably all people of colour being discriminated against, which we probably think is worse, and we actually don't mind if criminals don't have as good a time rehabilitating, if the alternative is literally every single person of colour not being able to progress in society. And look, even if none of that flies, less crime being committed is a really good thing for society. Not only do we have, less stuff happening for the victims, we also just have more social cohesion, lots of societal benefits, and we think that's really great. So the way I'm going to address these points of clash, I'm going to start with our rehabilitation, because that's the crux of their case. If we win that point of clash, we can actually win the entire debate because they have no other material. And under that, I've got the racism idea, which I think enhances that point of clash, and then I'm going to address repeat offenders, and within that, safety in society. But before I get to that, I'm just going to re-explain why these are definitely going to be small ankle bracelets. Well, they've told you that they're big, kind of just because they are and therefore have to be. We've told you, like technology is good. We can somehow have a smartwatch on Thomas's wrist which can do a million different things, including tracking your location, and like 40 other different things. If it can only do one of those 40 things, 40th of the size. Awesome. Also, It's really bad if these are massive. They've given you a bunch of mechanisms why it sucks for these to be massive ankle bracelets. The government's pretty smart. It probably knows that. They're the people making these ankle bracelets. Therefore, the government probably understands that these need to be small ankle bracelets. Therefore, they're going to be small ankle bracelets. And finally, look, people are pretty smart. They'll figure out how to loom band the ankle bracelets and all that and camouflage them in. They haven't engaged with any of these mechs, and so they're definitely going to be small ankle bracelets. Okay, first proper point of clash. Rehabilitation and integration. I'll take a POI.
Just on this point about these sort of inconspicuous ankle bracelets, don't we have sort of really similar things like parole right now? And they're not
Yeah, sure. The difference with parole bracelets is that has to, first of all, literally tell when you are leaving a house. Geofencing is way more difficult to do than Life 360 but in an ankle bracelet. Additionally, there's not that much money going into parole bracelets because it doesn't matter if they're massive or small. You're staying inside your house, no one cares. We've explained that it does matter if they're big or small when you're going outside. Therefore, the government wants to spend money on this. That actually doesn't engage with our mechs. Okay, cool. Rehabilitation integration. We have told you many, many things. Their principal responses have been ostracism, which has largely been reliant on the previous point of clash, and also gangs want people. So, first of all, I think the gangs want people, again, doesn't actually engage with our principal mechs. The reason we've told you gangs are going to want these people gone, and also you're going to want to be gone out of the gangs, is because gangs make money by doing crime, but chiefly by doing crime when people don't know they're doing crime. If as soon as a violent crime happens, one of their gang members is seen at the scene on this Life 360 but for criminals, that very clearly places that gang as at the scene as doing this crime. That's admissible in court, and now that gang gets racketeering charged up right to the top, and now, oh my god, it falls apart. They totally don't want these people involved, and so that's not going to happen. They're going to want to kick them out. Additionally, even if you're not involved in the gang, you don't want to be at the bar and then have your gang mate sexually assault someone, because then you're implicated in that, and there is no way you can prove that it wasn't you. Now, so we think that realistically you're going to leave gangs. That probably makes it a lot easier for you to rehabilitate, right? We can all agree that when you're surrounded by people doing crime, you're probably more likely to do crime. Therefore, we can actually win the rehabilitation point just off of gangs, because if you're not in a gang, you're a hell of a lot more likely to be rehabilitated, be able to get into a job. On the jobs point, I also think you probably can't get a job if you're actively in a gang. So they also can't win on that, but I'll engage with that directly next. So they've told us that people aren't going to get hired because people are going to know you're an offender, therefore you get ostracized. We have 3 points of clash here, and 3 responses and some contingency. First of all, we've told you the bracelet's small. I've kicked that cow to death. Second of all, we've told you that actually they're probably not doing customer service, right? Because if you're a violent offender, you're probably not that great at customer service anyway. They already know you're a violent offender because they already check your background. If you've got a low EQ, you're just not going to get hired for that. You're probably going to get hired for building roads and manual labor and all of that kind of thing. And actually, no one cares if the person who built your road was a violent offender, so long as the road works. So that probably doesn't matter for the specific jobs these people are working in. Note, that is gone completely unresponded. And additionally, in terms of getting your job, we actually think it's a lot worse if you cannot guarantee yourself as not having been at the scene. In terms of getting ostracized from your job and getting fired, it's actually a hell of a lot worse. Like Thomas told you, if every single time a violent crime is committed in your neighborhood, the police drag you out kicking and screaming from your job because they cannot possibly prove that you were not the person who did this. If they can just see, oh well, John wasn't there when this sexual assault happened, then clearly you're not involved, and so they don't pull you out of your job. Therefore, we actually get better jobs, less ostracism, less gangs on our side of the house. We win that point of clash very decisively. Note, that's really important because, again, it's their only benefit. If they can't prove prisoners are better rehabilitated, then they cannot win the debate. Actually, for us, it doesn't matter if prisoners are better rehabilitated because of these next 2 points. Racism. We think the alternative here is taking away information from the market. When you take away information from the market makes it up incorrectly. The way they do this is by deciding, oh, all people of colour are probably violent offenders. That's really bad, right? And actually we're willing to bite the bullet of violent offenders for the rest of their life potentially having bad outcomes, rather than the entire group of people of colour having bad outcomes for something they didn't do. A, there's more of them. B, if you've done a horrible thing, you probably deserve to be punished for that horrible thing. We're willing to bite that bullet. That's something they have not engaged with, and they have given you a bunch of mechanisms why ostracism is bad for people. Those are the exact same mechanisms why ostracism is bad for people of colour when you assume that they are violent offenders. So we can steal them and explain why they are having really bad outcomes for every single person of colour in the world. Or at the very least, a bunch of people who are loosely involved with violent offenders but aren't necessarily themselves, right? Like if you just happen to live in Moera, but you're not remotely involved in that circle, you're probably getting bad outcomes on their side of the house. Probably a bit of a Wellington-specific example. Okay, cool. Next point of clash, this is what we think is debate winning for us, and they simply cannot claim. And this is repeat offenders. Which house is getting less crime? We have given you two principal mechanisms for this. One, you're no longer involved in gangs, therefore you're probably less likely to be involved in crime, and two, you're being watched. So I'd like to go with their engagement with this first. They've told us that people still do crimes when there's CCTV around. This again doesn't engage with the mix of our case. We explained to you at first and second, and I'm explaining it again now, that the reason people commit crimes when CCTV around is because I have no idea how many cameras I walked past to get to this debate. None of us do. It's not something that's very easy to viscerally associate with. Versus if you are running up to murder the person and you literally feel the ankle bracelet rubbing against your ankle, that's a literal physical reminder. It's the kinds of things like that which make it really easy for you to understand that you are going to be caught and therefore more likely to not do the crime. We win on that next. Secondarily, I'd like to talk about crimes of passion versus premeditated crimes. So we definitely win premeditated crimes because if you're thinking about the ankle bracelet. Next, crimes of passion. They told you themselves at second that crimes of passion look like your environment which is violent. Now, I'd like to flag to you that all of our mechs around leaving a gang, which is fundamentally just a violent environment, also work here, right? A gang in this debate is functionally no different to just living in an area and hanging out with a whole bunch of people who tend to do violence but just don't have a patch. If you want to get out of that situation because you don't want to be implicated with a gang, you probably also want to get out of being implicated with a bunch of people who just do crime often. That means crimes of passion, like they said, come from bad environments. You want to get out of bad environments because you don't want to be implicated with crimes that other people commit. Therefore, we get less crimes of passion, so we get less premeditated, less crimes of passion. Those are the only two types of crime. We get less crime, therefore we win. Thank you very much.
Speech and invite the third speaker of the Negating.
This debate comes down to three main points of clash: the effects on rehabilitation, the effects on repeat offenders, and the influence on victims. In this debate, we're going to prove to you that repeat offending is relatively symmetrical on both sides, which means that the positive effects that we can claim out of rehabilitation that the affirming team simply cannot do become exponentially more important and are the reason that we can win this debate, along with the better influence on victims. What we get in this debate is a huge mischaracterization from the affirming team about what the majority of violent crime in New Zealand is. It's not the murder of some random guy on the street under the watchful eye of 20 surveillance cameras and your ankle bracelet. What we see the majority of the crime being, as mentioned by my second speaker, it's domestic crime, right? We see these things happening in the home. We see it having spousal abuse, and we see it within gangs, right? In areas where we do not believe that people are very likely to report these things, and we do not believe that even with these monitoring things, we do not believe that people feel particularly likely to be caught for these crimes, right? This is going to be relatively symmetrical on both sides of the house. They cannot claim that just because you have these things, you have any sort of more indication that your spouse is going to tell on you for beating them, right? This is going to happen on both sides of the house, and for that reason, we see that the majority of this crime, as it is domestic, is going to remain sort of equal on both sides. We also get this further really big push from the affirming team about how we're gonna, it's massively different if you know that you're gonna be caught, right? We've given you lots of material, but I'm just gonna sort of reaffirm this, right? We already know that you have these prison sentences. It's not actually, in today's society, you know that there's cameras around. A lot of the crime that people are committing, violent crime and stuff, it's kind of in public places, it's in bars and stuff. There is still a relatively good chance you'll be caught, right? This means that in most cases, right, people are still aware of the danger of committing these crimes, right? And because it isn't just the majority being, some murder of some random guy, It means that, like, in a lot of cases, it's going to be relatively symmetrical. And for that reason, we see that, like, this is the same, which means that the effects that we can claim on rehabilitation are going to be much, much stronger. I'll take a POI.
Yeah, every time someone's murdered, hundreds lose someone who made their life better. Do you see no value in preventing even 5 random murders in New Zealand every year?
Yes, we absolutely do. But we believe that there's also a hugely bigger effect on the many people, the children who are abused, the wives that are abused, the lives that are ruined through this, and the cycles of abuse that will be continued because of the negative effects of this crime, right? We see this as being even more important, right? Like, 5 people murdered is terrible. Hundreds and even thousands of people whose lives are ruined and cycles of abuse that will be continued because of this crime is even worse. We think it's incredibly important that we prevent that, right? And we do not see that the affirming team is really engaging in any way that this can be prevented more than on our side. Now, this is a point of rehabilitation, right? And why we're going to win on this. We tell you about kind of the effects on the effects of having these bracelets, right, on the ostracization. I just want to sort of reiterate this thing about, like, these inconspicuous bracelets. Like, we know that they can't be that inconspicuous. Like, the affirming team gives us, like, all these reasons why they have to be, like, irremovable. They have to be, you know, able to track them at all times, right, to, like, some small area, because that's, like, their whole mechanization about how they're going to be able to know exactly where you are at all times. They've told you that these are the reasons that it works in the houses, right, because they know exactly where they are. But for those reasons, it also has to work out in public, that they know that you are in that bar at the time of, like, this assault or murder, right? For those reasons, we see that, like, the bracelets aren't going to be that much smaller. Like, they're not going to be that inconspicuous. And, you know, people in general, you know, there's a good chance people will know, right? It means that we do see that there is likely to be more ostracization in society, right? It doesn't have to be for, like, every single person, but we see that there will be more. And what we get when we have this is we see that these people simply find it harder to integrate into society, right? At the end of the day, our prison system is supposed to be about rehabilitation. This means that what we want is at the end of people's sentence, we want them to be able to go out and we want to be able to go back into society and do better things in society, right? We want them to be able to live a normal life again. The punishment was their loss of liberty and their loss of freedom while they're in prison. That punishment should not continue, right? Especially when they can go out into society and right their wrongs, like through the sort of the rehabilitation programs that we currently have, right, which allow these people to go on and do better. On the affirming team, what we see is that these people are ostracized, right? We get this big push about, like, how gangs won't want them and how they won't, like, be able to join gangs, right? But we still see that in many cases, what people do is they look for other people that sort of, like, have a similar background, things that they can, like, share experiences with. What do they all have that they can identify themselves with? I don't know, maybe an ankle bracelet that they can all see, and now they can find these other people so that they can join up together in a way of kind of, like, feeling a sense of community, right? Because that's what we get at the end of the day. The affirming team, like, simply refuses to engage with the fact that, like, there's this huge, like, sort of idea that people seek groups to be accepted by, right? Like, this is really deep and, like, innate human nature. All people do this, right? This is why gangs are such a big thing. They want to look for, like, groups that they can be accepted to. Even if we bought this argument that gangs, like, wouldn't accept them, they will go out and they will find other people. And when you're surrounded by a bunch of other violent criminals, right, we just see that it is likely that these rehabilitation programs that we have in prisons are, like, likely to be less effective, right? Where they're likely to sort of result in kind of, like, more repeat offending, right? Which both teams agree is terrible, right? We don't want more reoffending. But what we do see is that when you're surrounded by a lot of people with, like, similar backgrounds and, like, reoffence rates, and when you are kind of, like, ostracized from jobs in general, which I will get back into, we see it that, like, people go into these kind of groups and they are, like, likely to kind of, like, seek out violent behavior, like, to make money, to do things, even if it's, like, slightly different to the violent crimes they might have committed. We still see them going out and kind of committing more issues. Sort of onto this point again about, like, jobs, right? We get this big push from the affirming team now that, you know, they won't be working in customer service because, like, obviously that isn't the jobs that they're sort of likely to get into. You know, even if this is the case, right? We see that they probably are likely to get sort of into some of these jobs because they're, like, really low level. Like, they don't require much skill in a lot of cases. Like, you don't have to, like, have much to be, like, a supermarket cashier. But even if they are, like, working on the roads, even if they are out in, like, the factories, right, they're still ostracized by, like, the other workers when, like, as they say, the police are coming in because they don't know who the criminals are because, like, on their side, these, you know, tiny bracelets, they have to, like, interview every single criminal and, like, you know, mile radius to like try figure out who it was, they're still going to be ostracized by the people they work with. They're still going to be like ostracized within their jobs. Of course, like on either side, the employers know, but on their side, you know, more people know, more people don't feel safe around these people, which like relates to this ostracization, which is why they find these communities. And because like it's harder for them to get jobs, it's harder for them to like be part of the society, we see it as being much more likely that they will have to engage in like violent behavior to make money, to make their living, right? Kind of on this point then of like racial bias, right? We see it as not in any way being better on the affirming side, right? In the current system, there's kind of like this kind of general idea that, you know, certain minorities are more likely to commit crime than others, right? Sadly, you know, in some ways there is like a point here, and it's because of like really deep social factors, right? Like cycles of poverty, cycles of crime that like are perpetrated, which makes it really hard to escape, right? Which is for, again, all the reasons why the affirming team can't claim that people are just going to like leave these kind of systems, right? But these people are likely to be in here, which means that they are likely to they are going to be the ones that have these ankle bracelets on. It's just going to be like another way of reaffirming that people in these minorities are going to be the ones that are committing the crime. It's not going to sort of increase like racial harmony in any way. It's going to be terrible for society. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech, and as is customary, reverse the speaking order and invite up the reply speaker from the negative.
Two main points of clash in this debate today have been, are people more likely to reoffend on either side of the house, and what the impact is on victims. So first of all, to start with reoffending. The Affirmative team have told us that people are least likely to reoffend because they know they're being watched and they can feel these bracelets, and that all violent crime is premeditated, so they'll think about it. But we've told you multiple times that, first of all, this is just simply not true. I mean, people commit crimes in front of other people who they can see are there. They commit crime in front of CCTV. They don't actually think about the fact that they're being watched. They want to commit this crime. We've also told you that people commit violent crimes because of deep-rooted societal issues. It's often like a spur-of-the-moment thing. It's often domestic violence where the thing is about being reported, not about whether or not you were there at the time. So we just think this is simply not true, and that actually we've told you that it's likely that people are more likely to reoffend with these bracelets because, as we said, it's harder for them to get jobs. It's harder for them to integrate into society. So even if we agree that on AF side, like, people actually can still get jobs that just aren't customer service, well, first of all, we tell you that actually they're still ostracised by the other workers, and they're still ostracised by the general public, which just in general makes it harder for them to make groups of friends who aren't other criminals in the same situation, which means this leads to like higher levels of gangs and higher levels of violence. So on the affirmative side, all we get is that there are more reoffenders, there is no chance of rehabilitation for criminals, and we're just like perpetuating this cycle of crime. So even if we take it that the gangs don't want these people anymore because they're being tracked, they're still going to like then just bond with other people who also have these ankle bracelets and still commit crimes. It just means that they're more likely to get imprisoned. But what we'd rather have is that them not be imprisoned at all, and they're back as an active member of society, and they can have a job, and they can like actually be like a good person because they can be rehabilitated. So this is why we win this point, because only exclusively on our side of the house we have less reoffenders, we have people being rehabilitated, and we just have less crime overall. On affirmative side of the house, we have just means that these people who reoffend are more likely to get caught, but they've still committed that violent act, which is still like a negative impact. So then if we move on to the victims, so the affirmative have once again told us that victims feel safer if they know, like, where the police know where the criminals are, and also if they can see in the streets who are the criminals because of the bracelets, which then they tell us they can't actually see the bracelets because they're too small and they're hidden. So this is a bit contradictory on their part. But even if we take it at the fact that victims feel safer because they know the police know where these criminals are, we just tell you that this is simply not true, because first of all, these criminals had to like commit the crime to be like once again caught by the police, so they're still as likely to commit this crime. And secondly, we tell you that actually victims feel safer if they know that these criminals are like being rehabilitated, they're trying to change, and they know there's like less crime in society is like a goal of the prison system, which just means that like actually just like the fact that police happen to know where these people are is actually like a very big impact in the first place. So actually the victims feel safer on our side of the house because they know that like we're trying to like stop these criminals from committing these crimes in the first place. Second of all, like there's been this push on like from our side that they have like less discrimination on their side of the house because we can now pinpoint who these criminals are. Once again, this is contradictory to the fact that you can't see the bracelets, which means you can't see and say like, oh look, this person of colour does not have a bracelet, they are not a criminal, I've solved racism. Like, we just see this is not true because first of all, you can't see the bracelets in the first place, but also like my second speaker told you, people of colour are actually like more likely to be overrepresented in the prison system, either because of like the way like the socio-economic places they've grown up in, or just because like when they're like convicted in the first place, they're more likely to be convicted than a white person. So we just see that actually now we see these bracelets and we reaffirm these like racist ideologies, and we can't like change as a society because it's then harder for these people to like not reoffend and not get back into that loop that they were in in the first place. So basically what this debate comes down to is like which side of the house commits less crime. So we've told you multiple times that people are less likely to reoffend on our side, they're more likely to be rehabilitated, and overall they're not like ostracized by society and then like grouped in with all of the rest of the violent criminals and just like continuing to commit crime. The affirmative side of the house have just shown us that like people are less likely to reoffend because they're being watched, and we've shown you this is simply not true. People watch them commit crimes in the first place. We see surveillance cameras, and even we see that people like are just like under the assumption that whoever they're committing the crime against just won't report it because either they're embarrassed or it's like a domestic violence situation where they can assume their spouse isn't going to report this crime. So we just see this as not being true, and in fact on their side of the house we have people more likely to reoffend and more likely to live in these circles of crime, and therefore they have like way worse outcomes than we do because we at least have some criminals rehabilitated, integrating back into society. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker for this speech and invite up the reply speaker from the affirming team.
Yes, please. That would be useful. At the point in which we stop, like 10 murders, at the point in which we stop, like a bunch of people being harassed at their workplace by the police, at the point in which we stop, like a bunch of people like being less racist to people of colour, right? We think we just win this debate. They've tried to frame it that like we need a majority of situations and all of these things. They've tried to say, hey look, there's this one time where like people commit crimes because CCTV doesn't happen. To win this debate, all we have to prove is a significant amount. 3 points of clash for you, very nicely, they all start with R's. We've got reoffending, rehab, and racism. Okay, reoffending. I just would like to note that this point basically relies on whether or not crimes are premeditated or not, okay? And note, we don't need this point to win the debate. We've still got better rehab, we've still got better racism. They cannot let us win this debate because at this point, because it affects so many people, they have to defend this, right? Okay. Basically, what have we got here? Whether or not it's premeditated, they've given us a bunch of reasons of like why, for example, domestic violence is unlikely to be premeditated. I think we've still given some mitigation of like and how in some situations it could still be. No, they haven't interacted with like some of the cases of murder, with all of the cases of gang violence. They haven't interacted with a bunch of our stuff, right? They needed to interact with like 90% of it to win this, right? What have we got? We've got all of this stuff about like whether it's like, it's going to be premeditated. They haven't responded to that. We've given you mix of how some situations are going to be premeditated. That's all we needed. And even if you don't believe this and you take their crimes of passion, we still think a significant amount of those are due because of the environment you're in. They've said it, we've said it. Note, we don't need all situations. You just need some to be in the environment because we've clearly explained why gangs don't want to have people that mean they're going to be arrested. They leave these organizations and therefore that's good. We take these people out of environments, all of their stuff about and we've given clear reasons why these people are aware and why it's more visceral to have an ankle bracelet than to be thinking about DNA or CCTV you've never seen. We win this point. What's their big thing on rehab? This is their big push. I think to win this point, they had to explain why trousers don't exist in their world. I think we clearly win this, right? Because we've shown mix and clear incentives and clear explanations of why these are going to be inconspicuous, right? And that also their then only response to this is people feel like a criminal and therefore they'll do criminal stuff. No, they haven't given us mix. I have no idea what this differentiation thingy-mabobby is, okay? But And also, all of their points then support all of our racism points, right? And then thirdly, we can just weigh this out, right? Because we've given you really clear things that haven't been responded to about all of this like workplace harassment effectively by the police. Again, we win this point. We're like so winning right now. Okay, finally, racism, right? This basically just comes down to whether or not you think Pam, who crosses the street, like every time she sees a person of colour, is going to feel more safe in this world where she thinks the police know all this information, right? Where the police know, like, all of these things, right? That's why it's not a contradiction. We think that we've clearly explained why people are going to feel safer. We've clearly explained why feeling safe leads to racism. We've clearly explained why, like, we don't think people are good judges of this, right? At that point, we win that again, right? What have we clearly shown here? We've clearly shown that we've got a bunch of different reasons of why in some situations there is most definitely, like, violent crime we are stopping. We've given a bunch of really good emotive weighing of why that is like really, really important. And we've also, then even if you don't believe that, still got this racism point. Even if you don't believe that, we've still got all of this rehab points. We most definitely win this debate. And we most definitely stop violent crimes. And that is amazing.
I'd like to thank the speaker for this speech, and also the sports thoroughly enjoyed the debate. I'd like you to cross the floor and shake hands, and I'll ask everyone to leave the room.
This is much bigger today. You said it was so bad. This one was actually fun to do. Yeah.
Good job.
Great job.
Great stuff. Debate. So much better than the one.
Okay, I guess it's good. I don't know. Like, we'll try and